This file serves as a brief introduction to the Ireland in Revolution course at the Halifax Public Library in fall of 2020. The course description says that the course will use Irish literature, especially the work of W.B. Yeats, to study anti-colonial revolution in Ireland, beginning in the post-famine era with the Young Ireland movement, before moving on to the Irish Land War and the extraordinary career of Charles Stewart Parnell, then turning to the formation of Sinn Féin and the 1916 rebellion that led to the War of Independence and the Irish Civil War. We will use literature to examine how and why Ireland pushed for freedom. Topics studied include nations and nationalism, blood sacrifice, boycotting, guerrilla warfare, Ireland's revolutionary women, definitions of terrorism, and the impact of poetry in the ballad form on the ideology of Irish republicanism. We then conclude with a brief account of the Irish counter-revolution, whereby Irish republicanism was suppressed by an alliance of the Catholic Church and the Irish Free States. The course text is W.B. Yeats' poetry drama prose, edited by James Pethica for Norton in 1996. This is available at Amazon, and it's a great little, well-edited, thoughtful collection of Yeats's poetry, drama, and critical writings, together with some essays at the back by noted critics, some greatest hits of the critical debate. For your purposes, the main point of interest will be the lecture series, and I'll be posting these as a series of PowerPoints and Zoom files, a variety of media in truth, yet to be decided. And the first one is already posted, and it's called Kathleen Ní Houliháin, 10 Theses. This is my attempt to get started. What I want to speak about over 4 lectures on Kathleen Ní Houliháin is the play in its relationship to the discourses of nationalism, possibly over 2 lectures. Yeats's hopes and fears for Irish literature, the ways in which Yeats's early literary projects, including Kathleen Ní Houliháin, fit into his plans for Ireland, the nation. I'm also interested in what I'm calling forming the nation. What does that mean? Well, I'm interested in the shape of nations, but also the shape of citizens, the kinds of people that are allowed to form part of a nation and what form those people take. People are obviously judged, excluded on all kinds of deformities of moral and physical character, racism, ethnicity, etc. So we're interested in nations and who gets to be on the inside and who gets to be on the outside. Kathleen Ní Houliháin is a play about strangers. At a key moment in that play, the poor old woman sings a ballad. And one of the main ways in which we have to try and theorize Irish nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism from the period after the famine and up to and culminating in independence for 26 counties, is the importance of the ballad form, of songs, political rebel songs. The ballad as form in the terms of how it reads in a 4/3 beat, its narrative scope, etc., but also the ways in which ideology circulates in the oral tradition, something that's much harder to police than book burning, for example. It's very difficult to kill somebody on the basis of a song they may or may not have sung when you weren't there to hear them. So that's the Republican ballad. 2 lectures on that, and we'll be looking at how Yeats writes ballads and responds to ballads as an act of cultural positioning in the struggle for Irish freedom. At a certain early point in his career, he wanted to be in on the Republican thing. And then at a certain point, he realized that his instinctive allegiances and his cultivated preferences lay elsewhere. So after the Republican ballad, I'm going to do a couple of history lectures. One of the challenges of this course is reading Irish literature against the backdrop of Irish history when we sometimes don't know much about either. So one of my jobs is to mediate the historical context whilst also giving sensitive readings of the texts as mediations of the history of that context. Here are 2, the ideology of land, famine context, and the ideology of land, the land war. Land is central to the Irish story because colonialism is central to the Irish story, and colonialism is all about expropriation, the appropriation of land. And in Ireland, land became the main way in which the colonial grievance was articulated, organised, and fought in a series of guerrilla wars, tactical boycotts, and so forth. We'll be studying those. Yeats was interested because he was of a Protestant ascendancy family, but he wasn't from the landed classes, though he wanted to be in fantasy at times. He liked the idea of big houses and plush furniture and places to look out on the swans while he wrote poetry. His own background, though, was middle class, merchants from Sligo. After that, we get into a section called Violence in the State. One of the things about this course and about colonial versus anti-colonial violence is who gets to decide who can be violent. Obviously, the government can always be violent. The occupying forces are de facto violent. But when can anti-colonial revolutionaries be violent? When is it okay to kill? When does thou shalt not kill become thou shalt? How, in other words, is violence legitimated around the issues of the foundation or destruction of the state? I think you'll agree it's a complicated issue. We're going to have 2 lectures and we're going to see how Yeats argues his way through that issue. But we're also going to take into account other people's theories. After that, we have 4 lectures on Yeats after 1916. Yeats's early play Kathleen Ní Houliháin, which we study at the beginning of the play, or rather of the course, is all about republicanism. And Yeats writes, along with Lady Gregory, a kind of bloodthirsty myth of sacrifice, blood sacrifice, as the source of regeneration for the Irish nation. There's a lot of loose talk in that play, and it's extremely powerful. Then in 1916, when a group of men and women actually did go out and fight and die for Ireland in the abortive uprising of 1916, Yeats was both horrified and transfixed. Here were the people who had fulfilled his prophecy, and yet they had died for their efforts, pardon me, and they had also killed as part of their efforts. So this question of violence came home to Yeats in a very real way. He called it the terrible beauty of 1916. So the terrible beauty of 1916 is Yeats attempting to navigate what happens when political sacrifices of the kind that he called for in Kathleen Ní Houliháin begin to get made on the streets of Dublin, and perhaps in his name. After 1916, Yeats gets more and more conservative and more horrified by the direction that Irish society is taking. The priests and the politicians joining hands to create a kind of theocratic state, a Catholic nation. And Yeats was instinctively repelled by that concept as a member of the Irish Protestant classes, but also as an artist who believed in aesthetic freedom, a kind of a Nietzschean politics of self-overcoming. All of this seemed petty, mindless, material, grim. So we're going to look at what we're calling the politics of ascendancy. Yeats's best poems in this period after 1916 are all about what it means to be a member of an embattled minority. So rather than identifying with the Irish nation or republic, he now identifies with the minorities it excludes. And the rest of the course shows us how this politics of exclusion, ascendancy, and censorship plays out in Yeats's late work. The course ends on biopolitics. Biopolitics is a theory of the government of peoples at the level of population. You don't get bogged down in the details of what's happening to whom. You just manage them as a 10% increase in this, or we need a 3% decrease in that. Biopolitics is the world of COVID, of how much you can afford to pay people to stay alive and how many people you can bear to let die in order to save money. It's the politics of human life and death, mediated at the level of populations. And Yeats is super interested in it. He's super interested in Nazi Germany. He admires, in a kind of complex way mediated by his Irish experience, he admires authoritarian governments, and he believes that singular individuals make history and the masses follow, and that this is their role. So the last lecture is then going to be called Yeats, Able Nationalism and Fascism. And it's going to bring us back to this notion of the form of the nation. What form does the nation take and who gets to form a part of it? Who is too morally or physically deformed to count as an embodiment of official Ireland? And there were all sorts of people who were counted or created as victims and outcasts of the Irish Free State. Yeats sees this happening and is gratified and horrified by it. But he also has his own version of a kind of able nationalism. And that's how we'll end the course. Yeats, we're going to go back at the very end of the play and show you how so many of the things that we've been looking at, ascendancy, biopolitics, able nationalism, and fascism, are actually right here in his earliest play, Kathleen Ni Houlihan. And in that way, I'm hoping that the course will describe a circle. We'll be reading poems, plays, prose, and critics. And every week I'll be giving you lectures with page numbers indexed to this book by Pethica. So if you really want to follow along and know where we're going and know where we're at, that's the book to get. Okay, that's a brief, perhaps a little rambling introduction to the course. I hope it makes sense. And every week I'll be doing my damnedest to post 2 lectures. Making them so far has been complicated, but I'm learning fast, mostly by failing, and hoping for your patience and interest and obviously questions and follow-up. Bye.